sort of
That's
thing.
good. It was interesting. I was just reading some stuff about. I don't even know who I wrote this to. I barely remember it, but it's pretty interesting. It was going on a march with Vietnam vets against the war to Gettysburg, 80 miles to Valley Forge.
Wow.
Much of my time has been spent with Vietnam veterans in various activities and planning. A beautiful 4-day march through New Jersey and Pennsylvania was an example. About 100 veterans marched 80 miles to Valley Forge, arriving there, a landmark of the U.S. Revolution, Civil War, on Labor Day, a national holiday. Along the road were guerrilla theater operations. I was killed and kicked around in a parking lot one day. At the end, a massive demonstration starting with a sweep down the hillside, shouting "Peace Now," which echoed around the hills, ending with a formation in which the orders were giving an attention, break arms, and plastic M16s were smashed all over the grass.
Do you remember that?
I remember doing one in a similar thing in Dallas. I don't remember that. Okay, that would have been 1971, no, that would have been 1972.
Tell me about the one you do remember.
We marched from, I think we went from like Fort Worth to Arlington, or Dallas to Arlington, and again would do, I was most of the time tied up like a Viet Cong, with a mask and hands behind my back, with Vietnam vets, pretend poking at me and kicking and stuff like that. But it was very, before that, the most for me, the most intense stuff with the vets was the two that we helped set up, which were the first times we got veterans talking in public about what they'd done, and those were just mind-blowing. It's like.
You make a distinction between somebody who is for peace, and somebody who's protesting the troops or that sort of, the war as it was. You try to draw a distinction between what you were doing and what.
The peace
movement.
There was a bunch of stuff. The peace movement itself, in my experience, was very political at the time, and you can see the very similar thing today. There were the people who were anti, and they tended to be militant. I remember there was a group actually called the Young Communist League that would come in a very systematic way and totally disrupt any kind of peaceful meeting you're trying to have. They would take it over. They would make it impossible for anything to happen. I mean, ended up you just have to leave. It was horrible. But in New York, the movement was very political. I was a sort of second class because I hadn't been to North Vietnam, right? I met Jane Fonda. She had, right?
Yeah.
But then there were the vets. Some of them who could get pretty militant, but most of them just said, the war is the enemy. Our policy is dead wrong here. It's totally wrong what we were doing. And I've met vets who've done all kinds of stuff, and I've met people who flew heroin for Air America, and I've met people who were told to wipe out a village, and they did it. And years later, we've not been able to live past it. So. I just read this really remarkable, wonderful book by a guy named Mark Bowden on the Battle of Hue at Tet 68, and he shows all sides. I mean, his first chapter is about these teenagers who are so excited because they're asked by their leader, their NLF leader, to be spies in Hue. And to set up, because they knew the city, to be able to set up routes for the North Vietnamese who were coming down, and then the soldiers, and by the end of it, it's just exactly what we're saying. War is the enemy. It's not one side or the other. The war was the enemy, and it made it impossible for anything positive to happen. It was just like, oof. So
You were in Tanzania before you went to Vietnam?
I was.
Okay, so
yeah.
Tell a little bit about how you
The whole
got
story.
there and then how that turned into Vietnam.
Okay, well, when I was a junior in college, the Peace Corps was brand new, and I applied for the Peace Corps because I thought that would be awesome. But at the same time, I heard about a program that I had learned a little bit about the American Friends Service Committee, and I actually had sort of a long story, but I had a little postcard in my desk drawer that said, longer overseas service assignments, because I'd been interested in their work camps. And I sent it off, and they sent me back information. They answered first. The Peace Corps never answered. So I went and met them, and they said, okay, this is the way I want to go, because they were just wonderful folks. And so they had a kind of a prototype of the Peace Corps kind of program in several places, and Tanzania was one, so that's where I went for 2 years. And there were a dozen of us scattered around the country working there with the Ministry of Community Development. But we would get together twice a year, and in one of these meetings, they called them unit meetings, we were asked to discuss the possibility of sending a group to Vietnam, because all the guys were conscientious objectors in the program. And I was taking notes for the group and then wrote them up, and by the time I finished this all, I had known nothing about Vietnam before, but by the time we finished this all, there's been a few things in my life that I knew were going to happen, and I knew I was going to Vietnam. It wasn't a question. So I came back that following summer, 66. I had already enrolled in a graduate program at the University of Pittsburgh, but I just started telling the director of the program, I'm going to Vietnam, and after 6 months she said, okay. So the next summer I went to Vietnam, and that was 67.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did you consider yourself, active in that way before you
I
went?
really considered myself, no, I considered myself, I couldn't believe the stories that were being told, and I just said, there was a sense of, I've got to go find this out for myself. And in any kind of situation like that, most people are not for one side or the other, and they're caught in the middle, and so that's who we worked with. So we got to, our inspiration was this Buddhist monk named Thich Nhat Hanh, who probably next to the Dalai Lama is the best known Buddhist on the planet right now. And he was the first Vietnamese to come to this country and speak out against the war. He was invited to Cornell University and has never been allowed back except once about 5 years ago. Got to go back for 3 weeks. And he was based in Paris, but he had started this wonderful little school for basically nonviolent social change, social service. And his students were our main teachers and our advisors, and they were the people we took our counsel from, and as much as we could worked with them in projects that they were working on. So like the orphanage that was home for me, we had a couple of the students who were working there and whatever. So that's how we did that.
Okay.
But they always, as Ty wrote, had this little book called Vietnam, Lotus in a Sea of Fire, and he says, the communists want to save us from capitalism, the capitalists want to save us from communism. All we want is to be saved from salvation, and just let us live our lives.
Okay.
Let us live our lives, and we can figure things out ourselves. So
wow. So I have to ask because
Sure.
I'm a Panhandle girl. That if I'd
Sure.
said I was gonna go to Vietnam, my family would have said I was crazy. Friends would have said I was crazy. What did you hear?
Well, I was not a Panhandle girl at the time.
Right.
I grew up in Cleveland. I went to school in Connecticut, college in Connecticut. I think Tanzania was harder for my parents or at least they showed more kind of when I said Tanzania than they did when I said Vietnam. By that time they were kind of used to it, and I was fully an adult, and so they were very gracious about it. And actually, both from Tanzania and Vietnam, I would send newsletters back periodically, and my mom would type them up and send them out to a number of people.
Wow.
But yeah.
So she helped you get the word out about.
She helped me get the word out to a great extent.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I can't imagine. If they were upset, they held it tightly. But I can't imagine what it would have been like during Tet, because during that time, it took 3 weeks to get the telegram from Saigon to me in Da Nang saying this is where we're going, get out, and another week before I was able to get any information out. And here they're sitting, not knowing what the heck is going on,
Oh.
you know, and knowing that they were in touch with Philadelphia at that time, and you know, Philadelphia didn't know where I was or how I was, or you know,
Right.
whatever. So I can't imagine what that would have been like for them. I really honor them for putting up with me.
Okay, so you knew in your gut you needed to go to Vietnam,
did,
but
yeah.
What do you believe, looking back at it, what do you believe led you to go there?
I have no idea. I mean, not in any real way. I mean, not in any. A lot of my life feels like it's been directed from someplace else, and that was one of those. It's like I've always known I was going to end up in Amarillo, since I was 10. I've known that. So it was one of those kinds of things, and what's interesting in my life, is since Vietnam, particularly since about. Everything around Vietnam has had this amazing set of synchronicities for me. It's like clockwork. If it would come up once, it would come up 3 times within 3 days in totally unrelated circumstances.
Wow.
So the best example I can give you from here was in 1994, and I had been, you know, when the boat people started coming and all that stuff, it's like, oh shoot, you know, it's like, ugh. And I withdrew from it all, and but in 1994, a friend who was taking a history class at WT gave me this book that her history professor Pete Peterson had given her, called by Lisa Hayslip, called When Heaven and Hell Changed Places, and it's the book that actually Oliver Stone turned into a movie. And I read that, and it's like, oh yeah, okay, because this kid, she was a kid at the time, grew up in outside Da Nang in a village that was run by the army in the daytime and by the NLF at night. Like so many Vietnamese families, she had people on all sides. Her oldest brother had gone north. Her next brother had been with the NLF and had been killed. Her older sister was married to the head of the Saigon police in Da Nang, you know. And here she was, this kid caught in the middle, and she'd ended up getting, long story, but she actually set up the first organ. She was the first one to go back in and start something, and she started, the first thing she did was a health clinic. So I read this book and wrote her a little note and, you know, sent her a little contribution, and about a week later, this letter arrived. When I first got to Da Nang, the orphanage I was supposed to be in wasn't open, so I stayed with this other lady who was a nun in a Cao Dai nun, that's a Vietnamese religion. And she was a nun with them, and she had been in the wrong place at the wrong time in Saigon when everything fell, and had been in prison for 2 years, and after 2 years had gotten back to Da Nang, had lost everything, but a cousin of hers who I had met once had kept my address, and in Cleveland, in the house that I grew up in. Well, my mom had moved since then, whatever. So she wrote this letter. I have it here actually. She wrote this letter somewhere here. Found it, saw it a few minutes ago, and
This maybe?
no, it's
Okay.
in an envelope.
Okay.
It's in an envelope. Maybe I can find it. And I took it over to one of our Habitat Vietnamese families to translate because I couldn't read it that much. And
Yes. You would have
and
See what I
basically
love
she
that.
said, you know, we miss you. You gave us hope. And I said, so. And then a week after that, get this thing from Lei Lee saying that they're going back, that they're taking a trip in October to open an orphanage. Now the orphanage that I lived in was named, there it is, was named for a Vietnamese nun who immolated herself as a prayer for peace, and this one was called Village of Hope. I said, okay, time to go. You know.
Yeah. That it is time to go.
And when I got to Da Nang, Chivan, who was actually she was living out in a village, but the next day happened to be a feast day, and she came in. So I saw her, and when I met her, it was like walking on the Star Trek of holodeck. All of a sudden, my Vietnamese came back. I knew where I was. I'd been totally disoriented before, but that happened. And then my one, who was my very favorite nun in the orphanage, was the only one who was still there, and she was now the head of that pagoda. So it was a pretty magical trip. But
It was serendipity for
yeah,
you to
yeah,
for
and,
that to
and,
all
and that's
happen.
the kind of thing that happened over and over and over again around Vietnam after I got back.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you go in 67. How
67.
old? How old are you?
I had my 25th birthday there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so talk about the work you did there. What
Well,
was it?
a lot of it was waiting around. For the first couple of months we were in Saigon, basically learning language and really figuring out what we were going to do, because we did not have jobs set up. And during that time, there was an orphanage that I went and taught English with, and basically hung out with the kids, and with a lot, as much as I could. And we did some small things like that. And then when I got to Da Nang, I was assigned to this orphanage that was. Everything was slow. It was a third world country, so everything was slow. It was supposed to open January 1st. No, they said it's going to open after Tet. Well, Tet came and it opened for 400 refugees. I mean, they were in overnight.
Wow.
And then that got they got moved out to a refugee camp, and then orphans started coming in. The first wave of them were actually kids from the sister orphanage in Hue, which is 60 miles north that one of my colleagues had been in. And that orphanage has been totally bombed out. One of the pictures of that is in my slideshow. But so great. Okay, this is what I'm going to do. Well, our group got pulled out. We got pulled to Singapore, and I said, look, I'm going back. And I sort of arranged to go back in, and came back. Was able to stay at the orphanage, but worked with the League of Red Cross and basically got food to refugee camps, and they had this program of setting up milk feeding programs in daycare centers and hospitals and orphanages, and so I was kind of the liaison to help make that happen. Humanitarian stuff, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So go back to when you first set foot in Vietnam. What was your first impression? Talk about what it was like.
Overwhelming. Overwhelming. It's a very intense country, for one thing, and I don't have that first newsletter here. I could give you some direct quotes, but crowded, noisy, motorcycles and military vehicles everywhere, dirty because of all of that. No color. That's one of the other things when I went back. The three things that I noticed first: no barbed wire, lots of color, and green everywhere. The rice fields are gorgeous when they're not bombed out. And Saigon is a big, dirty city that was full of American GIs and military trucks and vehicles that were too big for the streets, and so it was kind of overwhelming. Kind of overwhelming. Yeah.
And it looked like Americans had taken over pieces.
Huge parts of it. Yeah.
Hot. I would imagine.
Hot and humid. The Vietnamese wear these black satin pants, and you think, well, why? Because that's so hot. But they kept the mosquitoes away. And then you get these rainstorms, and you bicycle. I mean, I remember bicycling back from the orphanage in Saigon back to our apartment through water that was up to my knees. So it's,
bicycle or walking was your main transportation?
Yeah. For longer trips, public bus or Air Vietnam.
I've heard it was interesting to do that in a traditional Vietnamese dress.
There's something that an ao dai on a bicycle is a very sensuous thing, because what you do is it splits, and you got the front and the back. You've got pants on, and then it's tight to the waist, and then a split, basically a skirt in the front, and a skirt in the back. So you clip the end of your back skirt to the clip on the back, the whole books or whatever, and then you hold the front with your handlebars, and then you take off, and the breeze kind of blows up, and it's very it's luscious.
Okay, so Saigon the same way, very busy, crowded.
That was Saigon.
That was Saigon.
Yeah, Da Nang was much less. Da Nang was a smaller, much smaller town. It had its first traffic light when I went back in '94. It had none. It had all dirt roads in Da Nang, and it was not a village, but it was a town. It was a decent sized town, but the pace was much slower. There were trees, and it was a much pleasanter place to be for me.
And what did you live in? What did the people there live in, housing wise?
Housing wise was different places. So in Saigon, the group of us had an apartment on the second floor of somebody's house, and it had 3 rooms. It had basically 2 rooms and a sleeping loft. So the girls got 1 room, the boys got the sleeping loft, and sort of the middle room was everything else. We cooked in it and did everything else in it. The 1 bathroom, and the orphanage. The orphanage was hilarious. It was set up. It was new, and it was 2 stories, and it was kind of around a U, and there was a main room on the main floor, which is sort of the dining room area and study and all that stuff, and then there was an open room on the upstairs. There were bedrooms, 1 upstairs, 1 downstairs for the girls and boys. Or no, I guess the bedrooms were upstairs, boys on one side, girls on the other, and then sort of an open classroom on each side, and then a room in the back, which is where the nuns and I would stay. Except at the beginning, they put me up in this front room, which was like sleeping in a fishbowl, because it was right out in front, everybody could see. So that was that. Before that, when I went to Hue, I would stay in the hematology lab at the hospital. They had a cot there, and they said, "Yeah, you can stay there." Up in when I went to Dong Ha, when I went to Hoi An, I stayed in a really lovely Vietnamese house with a fairly wealthy family that were in charge of the Red Cross there. Nice family. And then in Dong Ha, I stayed with the Catholic nuns, and there we had the beds were basically low, foot and a half off the ground tables, 6 by 6 tables, and we slept on those with a mosquito net.
Must have been comfortable.
Oh, yeah, really appreciated a pillow. One of the strangest things that night was talking to this nun said, "Can I sleep with you tonight?" I said, "Sure." They didn't understand that I enjoyed sleeping on the bed by myself, even in a single. Our beds at the orphanage were basically cots with a 1-inch foam. And they couldn't understand why I wanted to sleep in a bed by myself. so that was for most Vietnamese, they just pile in because they had so little space.
Mm-hmm.
But that one night in Dong Ha, this nun comes, can I sleep with you? Sure. Says, "What's it like to be a Buddhist nun?" Go figure.
Mm-hmm.
So some experiences like that.
So first of all, I know you traipsed around with a typewriter. So what did you take with you to Vietnam?
What did I take with me? Not very much. I did take a typewriter. And I can't even remember how I got paper. I'm sure I could buy paper, but I can't remember how I stored it or anything. I'm totally, very few clothes. We bought some clothes when we were there, but very little. Mostly everything I had was a typewriter in a bag about like this.
Okay, so you had to be ready to be mobile.
Be ready to be mobile, and be ready to live off of what was there and what was possible. And you could get almost anything on the streets. And we did not use the PX. We didn't do that kind of thing. But you could get almost anything that you needed on the streets, and particularly in larger cities. And
the food? How?
Oh, food is great. Food is wonderful. Yeah, I love Vietnamese food.
At one point, you were still trying to get used to the fish sauce, I think.
Oh, Nuoc Mam? Yeah. Well, Nuoc Mam takes a bit. It's an acquired taste.
So, what supplies were most needed?
Again, it depended on where you were. I mean, farther north in this huge refugee camp, it was 5 miles from the DMZ. Anything. And we first trip up there, I took 7 tons of boxes of dried fish and tins of some kind of meat, ham, I think. The boxes were almost as valuable as the meat because they didn't have firewood, and to go out of the camp was to go into a free fire zone. So everything. They had one water tank that was refilled about every other day for 20,000 people. And so it was like you had a choice of having water or splashing yourself or making tea almost. And so those were big issues. The where we were, I mean, medicine was always in short supply. The Vietnamese medical system was primitive, very primitive compared to our stuff. Of course, it depends on where you are. I was perfectly comfortable with what we had. A typewriter was a luxury and had to be registered with the government.
Really?
Really.
Because you were going to do something deadly with it?
Any typewriter had to be registered. Because if they found anything that they didn't agree with, they could trace it back to whose typewriter it was.
Huh. How did they trace it? Just by the way it typed?
By the type.
Or did they stick a number on it?
No,
or?
by the type.
Huh.
Or at least that was what they said.
Did they have any discussions with you over what
No.
you were sending home?
No, because I wasn't sending anything out here, so that was it was the Saigon government we had to register with.
Huh. Okay.
So I left my typewriter in Vietnam.
Did you?
Yeah, I left it with somebody, with a friend.
You write about the girls behind the apartment, I guess, wanting to come up and type.
And type, yeah. This is a little girl who's about 12, and she was shy at first, but she became a good friend. And then they all came up. All the kids started coming up, and they were so excited to see a typewriter, and they wanted to borrow it. And I wouldn't let them have it. I said, no, it's not leaving here. You can type here. I'm not going to let you. I didn't want to take any chance of it getting destroyed for one thing, or messed up, so I couldn't use it.
Right. What were the children like?
Like children everywhere, curious, shy. Once they got to know you, delightful. Some of them could be nasty, particularly in Hue. I'd have stones thrown at me, and people would shout "Ba me" or "Moo me." In Hue it was "Moo me," which means Mrs. American. Throw stones. I had one little boy, right behind when I was living with the Cowdine I was out on the street back there one day, and these kids came up and were saying, "Give me money," and blah, 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 on like that. And I finally said, I'm not going to do that. You start begging from Americans, and you're going to become dependent upon them. Make your own way. And they went, "You number one," so that was nice. But the kids in the orphanage were so sweet. They were just precious.
And obviously, I guess we had all the orphanages because they were separated from their families.
Separated from their families. Not all were total orphans, but because sort of the most heart-wrenching experience was actually my second trip up to the big refugee camp, and I'd stay in Dom Ha. And the nuns weren't there that time, but this 12-year-old girl had been brought in by her father with her younger sister and their baby brother, who was just tiny, because their mother had been killed, and they'd brought them into the church to say, "Look, can you take care of these kids, because I can't keep them at home." And spent the night with this 12-year-old just rocking this baby, trying to rock this baby to sleep all night. And then the next morning I'm waiting for the truck, and so I'm waiting. It's hot as Hades, and the priest had kind of a nice living area in their side and a big thick adobe wall, so the building was cool. And so I went in, and there was a big barrel that said World Vision on it. And I looked inside, and it was 7th grade sex education textbooks. What you do on your first date.
Okay.
Could be used for firewood. You could cook a meal over one of those, probably. But just those juxtapositions were like, oh my God, give me a break.
What gave you joy when you were working with the children?
The children gave me joy. The children were just remarkable. And they had, the Vietnamese have this saying, "Đi choy," and it just means go play. When you don't have anything to do, you đi choy, which means you just go out and mess around. and became and they're very good at it, and they do it, whenever they can, and it's not often enough, but they really take pleasure in it, and so that gave me joy. But the children were the people gave me joy. I mean, they're just wonderful, wonderful people that we got to work with, and some who weren't, but a lot of. It's like any society. There are people that you really, really are drawn to. People who are just wonderful. People who are naysayers, and people who are something else.
Right.
But
so.
But the kids were remarkable. I mean, and to watch the resilience of these kids who'd watched their families burn. One particularly sweet time, I was in Hue, and I was at the orphanage there that had been bombed out, and here's this 10, 12-year-old kid, tiny, about this tall, and his parents had been killed, and he went up, got a buddy, and went up by himself and did all the prayers, the Buddhist prayers for his family, and just did them night after night. They would do them for like 30 nights in a row, and he knew them all and would just go do them. That kind of resilience, and then carry on and go forth, and it's really remarkable. Remarkable. If you read this book, Mark Bowden's on Hue, you get a sense of what life was like for Vietnamese in that situation, and there were, particularly for the NLF, they lived under conditions that can't imagine. The Americans did too, but they had support. These guys were on their own, and it was like, whoa, what they had to deal with. Remarkable.
Such as,
they had no armor or anything. They had a gun, and they had flip-flops and sandals and basically black pajamas or some kind of small light uniform. They would live for days in tunnels. They would have if they were lucky, they got a ball of rice with a little bit of salt in it for a day. So for a day, rations. If they were lucky, they would eat a meal once every 2 or 3 weeks. A real meal. In many cases, and just remarkable stuff like that.
I hear the troops that I've interviewed talk about, the veterans talk about how when they were in villages, the people were friendly, but they couldn't tell who was friendly and who was foe.
Sure, of course you can't.
Yeah,
of course you can't. And because nobody wore uniforms. They were the whole idea of I never knew. I'm sure I knew. I have some suspicions. I'm sure I knew people who were in the NLF, but I don't know who they were. And what we would do would be, we trusted our Vietnamese counterparts, and they said if they'd say don't go, we didn't go. And if they said, hey, stop talking, and that happened a couple of times, I said, you got to quit that conversation. You're going to get us all in trouble, okay? And so we really followed their advice, and they knew. Yeah. We didn't.
We all talk about the things that were done that shouldn't have maybe been done in to the people in Vietnam, but when I talk to them, they say somebody has had a baby strapped to them and a bomb strapped on them or something like that.
There's violence on all sides. That's why I say the war is the enemy. It's not one side or the other. Not one side or the other. The firepower and the power of destruction that we had was way superior to any power of destruction they had, and that's what was overwhelming, and but there's no question that there was violence on all sides. When people get desperate, they get desperate, and that doesn't matter what situation you're in. You can see it. The GIs would get scared and desperate, and Vietnamese would too.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Were you close by when the orphanage at Hue was?
No, I was in Da Nang, and I was actually at the other end I was down at the Ka Dai Temple, which is the other end of town from where Vietnam got hit, and Vietnam was not hit badly. Hue was totally destroyed. Da Nang was not. And I was, we just heard a lot of noise and thought it was firecrackers because the Night of Tet is a noisy night. And I got up the next day to go down to the orphanage to say Happy New Year, and I found refugees streaming in, so went back and told the other folks, hey, there's folks down there that need our help, so we brought people down. So that was kind of my experience.
When you got there, you wrote in your journal about hearing the noise of the war from your apartment.
Oh yeah, you heard it all the time. It was very loud, very loud,
Yeah.
very loud.
That's hard to get used to, I would imagine.
You never do. At least I never did.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd be driving down the road. You'd be driving down the road, and there'd be bombing going on as close as as Fillmore Street.
Wow.
Yeah. But it's not right here, so you keep going.
You talk about getting in convoys, or trying to get somewhere, and convoys being between you and
Getting there.
And getting there.
Yeah.
You know.
So the military vehicles had the right of way, and the American military had the first right of way, and their trucks were big, and so you had to just wait until they went by, and they didn't go fast, generally.
Right.
And so the longest trip was a 60-mile trip that took 16 hours. 16 hours in the back of a bus, and it was raining, and there was no food, and that was a trip.
That is a long time.
That was a long time.
To try to go 60 miles.
60 miles. It would have been faster.
From here to
walk.
Pampa.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
16 hours.
are there other times that besides when you saw the violence, but are there other times when it was just obvious that war was intersecting with the villages where you were at?
Yeah, and I wasn't really in villages very much. I was mostly in Da Nang and Hue, and some of the smaller towns, Hoi An, just south of there, which were towns. What everybody said was that what I kept being told is, I wish you could go to the villages because it's so much nicer in the villages. But we couldn't.
Couldn't take the risk?
We couldn't take the risk, and because you couldn't take the risk either to us or to them. I did get to go to one on a trip before I went to Da Nang, and this was a really beautiful place not too far from Cam Ranh Bay that had been settled by a priest had brought a bunch of North Vietnamese down in 1954. And it was beautiful. I mean, you could really get a sense of what a traditional Vietnamese village was like in that one. But that was the only time. That was the only time.
Yeah, you talk about seeing pagodas and some very beautiful
some beautiful places. Yeah,
places.
Yeah. And the pagodas that when I was in, the one I talk about is when I was in Hue. The students would take us out, but that would just be 3-5 kilometers out and back to Hue. So it wasn't really a village; it was a pagoda that's out in the woods somewhere.
There were times when you were afraid for your life?
Not really. Twice. There was one time when we I lucked out. I mean, most of our group had pretty horrendous experiences during Tet. I did not. But there was one time when we pulled all the kids into the stairwell of the orphanage because they were bombing at our end, or shelling at our end of town. And there was one time I was in a convoy, and there was a mine went off 2 cars ahead of us. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. The car was sort of destroyed, but nobody was hurt. Those were the only 2 kind of real jolts that I got.
Right. Describe the 48 hours, your experiences during the Tet Offensive, that kind of 48 hours period.
Okay, so our orphanage technically wasn't open, and the day before I'd been out down there, our neighbors across the street were making this wonderful ginger candy, mukgung they called it, and getting all kinds of muk means candy, and gung is ginger.
Okay.
It's like candied ginger.
Okay.
And it's delicious, and that's a favorite for Tet. And they were making that, and then my friend Sivan, the Khao Dai Nun, said, "You've got to come here for Tet." So okay, so I did. And I spent the night with them, and they had a church service, and we were just listening to the firecrackers, and I went to sleep finally, and then I got up the next morning and went down to the orphanage, and that's when I saw what had happened, and I started seeing people streaming in, and a couple of them I'd been to Hue before then and had met some of the kids, and a couple of them were the kids that I had met at the orphanage in Hue, and they'd lived, their family lived outside Da Nang, and so I took off and went back and told my friend Sivan and then another friend that this was happening, and they need help and help organize and cook and stuff for these refugees. And so we all went down there and did that. You know, worked our tails off for the next week.
Was it noisy?
It was noisy. We had each family would be given about 10 square feet on the floor. That was their home and they were within about 3 days they had set up a regular refugee camp up on the edge of town, and none of them wanted to go up there because they said it was already too crowded. But we had to take them up. We had to send them up there, and we took them up there. And then I ended up going up and helping out up there, mostly helping with kids and welcoming people from Hue who I'd met and stuff like that.
How many were in the orphanage, and how many were hurt or killed?
We had about 400 refugees the first night in the orphanage, and that was very crowded. By a week later, we had maybe 50.
Yeah.
And then all of them went, and then the orphans started coming, and I think total we had about 80 kids, more boys than girls, and ages about 5 to 15. A lot of them had been at the orphanage in Hue, and they couldn't go back up there because the place had been destroyed.
Well, if the orphanage itself was bombed, or
not
or
our orphanage was not, but the orphanage
Right.
the orphanage in Hue was bombed. But most of the kids, Tet is such a big deal that kids would go to any relatives they could. Then that's everybody went to somebody in the family. So there were very few people left in the orphanage in Hue when it was bombed.
Okay.
One of them was our colleague, and he spent 10 days. He was a little guy, short guy, and he spent 10 days under a bed or in a closet, mostly because if anybody had come in and seen him with blonde and blue eyes, it would have endangered everybody else. And finally, when there was a lull, they dressed him in Vietnamese clothes and said, "Hey, the ARVN base is right down there. You go, get out of here." And he did. And the first thing when the kids showed up at my orphanage, the first question is, "Where's Raph?" You know,
Yeah.
so
Wanted to know what happened.
what
to
happened to him. But he got there and got to Saigon. Actually, got out of the country.
Wow.
2 weeks before I did.
Well, yeah, and that's what they told you to do, too.
Yeah, but it took 3 weeks for the telegram to get to Da Nang. And in the meantime, I was pretty sure that would happen, and so in the meantime, I'd sort of arranged a way to get back.
Yeah. So you arranged it with then the Red Cross?
It was the League of Red Cross. Here's another one of these crazy synchronicities. There was a German hospital ship stationed in Da Nang, and the doctor there was sort of fascinated with me, and so he'd come and I got them to give bicycles to all the kids in the orphanage and some stuff like that. Well, he actually created a job for me so that I could come back, but then this other one came up, and it was a better fit for what I wanted to do, and the time frame was better because I knew I didn't want to stay, for another 2 years, but this was a shorter time. And a year and a half later, I tried to go back to Vietnam. They wouldn't let me in, but I met a gal who was going to take that job that had been created for me in the hospital ship on the plane going in.
On the plane?
On the plane. We were in the same
Wow.
plane. Yeah.
Wow.
So
how much worse was it after Tet?
everything was much more tense. Everything was much more tense. There's no, certainly the curfews were up. The mother of one of my friends, who I adored this woman. She was just one of the sweetest people. Chinen came and said, "Mom's in prison," or, told me her mother was in prison. And she'd been in prison because she'd met a villager at the market, and it was curfew. And so she had invited the villager back to her house, and they'd come and arrested her because she'd housed somebody from the village.
Wow. What happened to her?
I never found out. I never found out. I went with Chinen to try to see her at the prison one time, which meant standing outside a gate, and then there were the prison wall. The building was maybe 50 yards away, and and we never saw her that time. A couple weeks later, Nan said that she had actually seen her, but I never heard what happened. Never heard what happened.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's so much sentiment about the war. You know, there were conscientious objectors. There were all sorts of people. How do you take that 360 view? What do you think of the war now? And how do you see it from all those perspectives?
It was bad policy. It was bad policy all the way around. You know, most popular songs, 1,000 Years of Slaves of the Chinese, 100 Years of Colony of War, a Colony of France, 20 years of this war. The inheritance that the mother passes on to her child is the inheritance of a sad Vietnam. And the hubris, what I take away from it is that the hubris that we have, that we think that we have the only right way, is damaging. If we had supported not communism, but supported the Vietnamese in any way, we would have had the best ally in Southeast Asia possible, is my take, because they loved us. They loved us. They just said, I mean, questions like, do Americans like war? Why are you doing this? This makes no sense. And we're Vietnamese. We know our own country. And even though parts of it we don't like, but the policy was dead wrong. And you get it in this book by Mark Bowden on the story of Hue. Westmoreland was all about, when you official policy is we have to kill them to save them, you're in a no end. You're not in a good. What can you say? What can you say if that's your policy? If that's official policy, and when the only answer that you have is more firepower, that's official policy. And what we learned is, despite what everything we thought we gave it, they knew their country better than we did. They knew how to work it. I mean, just the logistics of people getting into cities without anybody knowing about it, and thousands of people, both in Hue and Saigon, and I'm sure other places as well. Those are the best documented. Thousands in, and. You don't make friends by beating people up. You make friends by making friends. And and we were the policy was wrong, and it damaged everybody. It damaged the Americans. It damaged the Vietnamese. It damaged our reputation. It damaged it. It was just wrong. It was just bad policy.
You talk about Jane Fonda a moment ago, and having met her. She's a lightning rod.
She is a lightning rod for people.
This.
She is a lightning rod for people, and I think she regrets having done that at this point. That's the take that we have was you don't need to be bravado. There's not one right or wrong. The war is the enemy, and let us figure out how to live together in our own country. Of course, the history is that we kept the election that was supposed to happen in 1954 from happening. So from that perspective, we're responsible, because there was supposed to be an election in 1954. And what did we do? We brought, in a 90% Buddhist country, we brought a Catholic wealthy man, who had been hanging out in upstate New York for 10 years. To become the president of Vietnam. So
miscalculation there.
Total.
Yeah.
Total.
You have soldiers that grew up with their parents. Many of the ones I've talked to, their fathers being in World War II, and
their uncles in Korea, and
they went to do their duty.
Mm-hmm.
How do you? And then what happened to them when they came home? How do you view?
I felt really badly about the way the GIs were. I mean, when I came back, um, the people that I could hang out with were the vets.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, if you'd been in the country, you'd been in it. If you hadn't, you hadn't. There was no way you could understand it at all if you hadn't stepped foot in it. And so it was mostly the Vets Against the War. And, you know, as I read earlier, you know, went on protest marches with them, worked, helped to set up those hearings and did stuff with that. But those were the people that I was closest to. So, and again, they knew the folly of this policy. They knew it. They could see it. But they were powerless.
When they even talk about the 5 o'clock follies that,
absolutely.
that you mentioned.
Yeah.
The press conferences.
Is that we're a joke. We're totally a joke. Totally a joke.
To say what we were doing when it wasn't.
Well, it had no relation to reality. None.
How do you think the media, what role did that play in how the Vietnam War unfolded?
I think that the media was critical in showing at least a little bit of the reality of what was happening. So they were critical in shifting. I mean, there's a wonderful thing again in this book on Hue when Walter Cronkite went for the first time, and his report back from that is like, this is not what we've been told, you know. So I think they were critical.
You think that is the genesis of some of the distrust people have in their government now?
Absolutely. And I think it's the reason that they now insist that reporters are embedded with the military units. You know, it's how dare you go talk to somebody that we don't agree with. You know. Mm-hmm. And I can see that from both sides, but it is something that would raise questions about how free our press really is. Mm-hmm. You know.
Yeah. So, what did you take from that experience? How did that influence who you've become?
Profoundly. Profoundly. I can't tell you specifics, but profoundly. I think one of it is certainly an appreciation that the reality is not normally what you're really seeing. That war is definitely the enemy. That when you destroy land, and you destroy culture, you destroy more than culture, you destroy spirit. And people are unbelievably resilient. I'd always been kind of service-minded, but it was like, oh my gosh, I haven't begun to, scratch the surface of what's possible and what people do. And I certainly came away thinking that anti-anything doesn't work. What is it that we want? Let's create the society we want. Whenever you're trying to fight something that you don't want, you're just giving it energy. So let's start from a different perspective.
Well, and you're always.
Yeah, you're always. It's always. And this is what the Buddhists were saying. You've got this and this, and we'd like to be the third force that can kind of meld them all together and go to a higher perspective that we can all live with, and that's where the Buddhists were. That's where the Buddhists were.
You came back and you did spend some time with.
Yeah, so I came back. I'd started a graduate program in Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh, but after Tanzania, left that in the middle to go. So I went back and finished that, and then I'd love to tell people I got a master's degree in Public and International Affairs to show for Vietnamese Buddhist monks in Paris. So Thich Nhat Hanh at that point was, when I left Vietnam in 68, he was in Hong Kong, and I carried letters to him because everything was censored, so I carried letters to him in Hong Kong and spent 3 days with him there. And he invited me to come over, and so I lived and worked with them for 9 months. in their headquarters in Paris. They now have this wonderful community in southern France. It's a magnet for people from all over the world. But that was before that got up and going. And so I did that. And then an opportunity came on a very short trip to go back to Vietnam, and I tried to do it, and they wouldn't let me in. So I ended up in New York, first in the anti-war movement, and then the opportunity came to move to San Antonio and take over the job for the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, based in San Antonio, and that's when I came in 71.
So you participated in the anti-war movement, but
Oh,
you
yeah.
were trying to do it from
a positive perspective.
yeah.
So my work was much more. I worked with the vets. One of the things that happened, I was working in this organization called the Center for Constitutional Rights, and I started getting these letters. The guy who had exactly the same typewriter that I had in Vietnam, so I recognized it, from Okinawa, that was begging for somebody to come to help GIs figure out how not to have to go into Vietnam. And so I asked these attorneys I was working for, and they said, well, if you find somebody, we'll send them for 2 years, and here's I suggest you call this person first. And the first guy we found actually went and did a great job of it. So I did that, and I did a lot of speaking and that kind of thing. But when I got to San Antonio, it was such a relief, because all of a sudden, my experience made sense. One of the things we did in the peace movement, the stuff with the vets, but then we had what was called the People's Peace Treaty, and when everybody was running around Washington getting arrested, I was standing on the courthouse, the steps of the Capitol with a treaty between the people of Vietnam and the people of the United States, and asking people to sign. That's what I did then. Yeah.
Did you ever come close to getting arrested?
I got arrested once. Got
Okay.
arrested once in New York. It was a protest outside the UN, and lots of us were taken down to the city jail in New York, and this great big tank room about once and a half the size of this office, with about 40 of us in it, and they gave us bologna sandwiches, and about 2 hours later let us all go. That was it. My Hunter had been my former, my husband. He had been active in the peace movement in Colombia. He was teaching at Columbia at the time, and when the riots happened there, he was kind of in the center of trying to calm things down, and he went on protests. And he got arrested and spent 3 days in jail, and like 8 people in a one-man cell in D.C. one time.
So his record is longer than yours.
His record's longer than mine. Yeah, yeah.
Well, tell me a little bit about what you've got here.
Oh, well, let's see. I'm just kind of looking through some stuff. These are some of our favorite songs. My favorite songs. There's one in here. It's my very favorite of the anti-war songs.
And you can still read this and speak it. And
well, this one I've memorized, so I can do this one. If I can find it, but I can sing it for you. Tu rung dom hôm nay hoang vu tu rung dom hoang vu hôm nay ta cầm hát với nhau hồi này giữ ngàn đôi nhà nan màu áo nhưng cuộc sống vẫn mang niềm vui. Thư nhạc đàn trên hai thái khô xin hai cánh cánh lặng thương gió dù rừng đầm hôm nay hoang vu ta cùng tiếng bốc cho ngày mai đắc hoang tha phá đắc khô thơ cài đắc mang hoa thắm tương lai tha đời đắc tha thối đắc tha bồi đắc tha ngôi đắc tha sồi đắc cho tha sớm quê hương tha gồm đắc cho tha chết quê hương tha về. Rồi ngày mai đắc tha vườn thơm vui lửa môi, rồi ngày mai đắc tha hoa lên hồ môi cùi, rồi ngày mai quê hương soi lên vào sông núi vì hôm nay anh đã quê trong vì đắc nai. And I can hardly sing, but that says, from the ruined fields today we still sing together these words. Though 1,000 lives are hard and sad, still life carries joy. From 2 exhausted dry hands I pray that effort will rise 1 more hour. Though today the fields go on until we still move 1 step towards tomorrow. Our ruined fields, our dry, bare earth. Earth bears bright flowers, our future is here. Our earth is sick, our earth is in rags, our earth is wretched, our earth sits. The earth gives us birth, our homeland bears us. The earth gives us death, to our homeland we return. Tomorrow the earth will stretch forth green with the smell of new rice. Tomorrow bright lips will smile, bright flowers will bloom. Red lips will smile, bright flowers will bloom. Tomorrow the earth will stretch forth green, the color of rivers and hills, because today our people are determined to live because of this earth.
Wow.
Yeah.
Was that written during that time, or
That was
is
written
it
during
from
that
an
time.
earlier
No,
one?
that was
Okay.
written during that time. And he was
Okay.
he spent time in prison for that. It was illegal to be for peace in Vietnam.
Hmm.
It was illegal to be for peace.
And who wrote it?
A man named Minh Duc Thang. He now lives in Germany. I Googled him recently to see if I could find a copy of that online. That other favorite one by Trinh Khăm Shan was known as, he was like, everybody calls him the Bob Dylan of Vietnam. Much more lyrical melodies than Bob Dylan, but that one, that Ganam No Lei Zhat Tao, the 1,000 Years of the Slaves of the Chinese, that one you can find online. But not sung. I don't like the way it's sung, but the way I found it. But it was that was a very popular song. Very popular song.
I can see why, for people who were...
Well, and because it's so lyrical. Mo Ganam Do Le Zhat Tao, Mo Cham Nam Do Ho Yat Tai, Hai Mui Nam Noi Chin Tung Lai, Shat Tai Kua Me De Lai Chao Kan, Shat Tai Kua Me La Nuk Viet Buon. So it really, it moves. It's an easy song.
Right.
And I keep hearing people who knew it, you know, it's like over, when I went back with Lei Lee, I took my copy of that songbook, of which of course they grabbed, and we all just sang it. They were so excited to see that, they hadn't heard it for years. So.
You had a photo in here too. I wanted to see what that was. I always love the photos. Your photos are wonderful.
Well, this is. Let's see. I think that was. Yeah.
Had you written a journal before?
I kept one in Tanzania as well.
Okay.
I haven't read that one.
And
there I was in 1969
Oh, I love
or
it.
70. This was right after I came back in '94. So that was that picture.
Okay. Oh, I'd love a copy of these.
I think you can take that copy. I think I have another one.
You're very earnest here.
Yeah. Oh, I was very earnest. I was very earnest in those days.
There it is, the photo.
This was okay. This was with the Vietnamese in Paris. We actually set up a conference in Fontainebleau, and I think that's where that was.
Oh, beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And there you are.
And there I am. I don't have a lot of pictures of me. I don't tend to take them or keep them.
Right, right. And so, what do you hope people get out of the photo exhibit?
Well, it's interesting, you know, because it's no more heart-wrenching than what we've seen out of any war. It just happens to have been the one that I experienced. I hope that I've not seen the Ken Burns. I hope that, I know that where I've shown it before, nobody had seen pictures of civilians. You know? I did a slideshow one time for a bunch of folks I happened to be at a Habitat meeting in New Hampshire, and so I met these guys. This guy had been a reporter for National Geographic, and I showed him my slides, and he burst into tears. I said, I've never seen pictures of civilians before. So
That's incredible.
yeah. So all of our pictures were of military view of everything, and so hopefully, what I can show is, you know, people had lives and they went on, and this is what it's like for the people who live under this stuff, you know,
While war is going on.
while war is going on.
Yeah, the title I think is Views from the Edges of the War Zone.
The edge of the war zone, yeah. View from the edge of the war zone.
Do you think you got a good perspective from the edge of the war zone?
I got the perspective I got, and I think that if there's one thing that's true of Vietnam and probably almost any war, is that no two people's experience is the same. So ours tended to be, there were not many of us who went in seeking the perspective that we were there to engage, and so we tended to get a perspective that very few others have gotten, which was a privilege and a gift. But it's the perspective that I had, So, yeah, that's it.
Is it time now, this many years after the war, for everybody? Do you think it's softened enough in memory to try to figure out how to agree on the horrors of the war without being against each other as far as veterans and peace activists and things like that? Or you think that'll ever heal?
I hope it will heal. I mean, I you know, as I said, the war was the enemy. It was the policy. It wasn't the soldiers. It wasn't the soldiers. One kind of wake up experience for me. I was driving with a Vietnamese Buddhist chaplain in a Jeep, and American trucks came by, and they were always big and noisy, and they would try to run you off the road. And I was just like, ugh. He just said, "Don't be mad at them. They don't want to be here any more than we want them here." So
Kind of put it all in perspective.
puts it all in perspective. Yeah,
Okay.
puts it all in perspective.
I appreciate your telling these stories so much.
Yeah, thank you.
So.
Appreciate the opportunity.